Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to be explaining the first version of a board game that I'm currently developing. This is done sort of for a school project, and I'm making these video logs to help me, for my own sake, to remember how this game's development went. So this is the first version of the game that I've settled on. The second version will probably look pretty different than this, but it'll still have the same vibe as this, but just more fun to play, hopefully. But anyway, what is this game called Turn the Tables? Well, I was hoping to create sort of a fusion between chess and Paper Mario the Origami King's battle system, as weird as that may sound. If you've played or watched videos of the Origami King, then this sort of circular arena with rings is pretty recognizable. There are only 8 slices instead of 12, although I am actually planning to increase it to 12 in the next version, so it'll just be even more similar to Origami King in that respect. But what I was trying to hopefully accomplish is make it so in Origami King, not a lot of people liked the battle system, but I would find it to be rather satisfying whenever I was able to pull off a smart set of ring moves to line up all the enemies correctly. I understand the battles got repetitive, but I still think that the battle system was an interesting idea, if not executed very well. So in this version, it's actually played with 2 players, and the objective is to get your king, represented by the star, into the center of the board. The first player to do so will win. So how does that done? Well, on your turn you can take 3 actions, and there are a few possible actions you can take. The first one is simply placing a piece on the board. You can take any piece that's in this sort of out of bounds zone here and place it on one of your 2 entry tiles. The 2 entry tiles are just the 2 that are closest to you, so even if a ring is rotated, now these are the entry tiles. Of course, if a piece of either color is already on your entry tile, you can't place another piece on top of it. You'll have to do something to move that piece. The one exception, of course, being this piece called the pusher, but I'll get to more details on that later. The second possible action you can take is if you have a piece of your own color on a ring, you're able to rotate that ring around. So the green player would be able to rotate this ring here, ring number 2, but he would not be able to rotate ring 3, 4, or 1, and the center can't be rotated, not like it would matter anyways. The exception, of course, would be if your opponent's blocker is on that ring, but again, I'll get to more details that later. And the third option for your turn is you can move a piece. So each piece has slightly different rules for movement and also different powers. So the king is the most basic piece. It can only move inwards, and it can only move 1 space at a time. Once it's in the inner ring, you can then move it to the center on your next turn, and you win. The blocker, represented by the square, can move any number of tiles along the slice it's in. It cannot jump over to the center and go to the other side, meaning that the maximum number of tiles it can move at once is 3. And if there's another piece in the way, it can't go past it. So in this case, the blocker can only move to here and nowhere else without rotating a ring. The destroyer, represented by the triangle, has the same movement rules as the blocker. It can move along any number of tiles in its slice. It can't jump the center, and it is not able to move past other pieces. The pusher has a bit more flexibility in its movement. It's restricted to its row, but it can jump over the center. So you can move this pusher to any of these tiles. You can't move it into the center, but you can have it jump over the center as such, and move it along like that. Now onto the piece's special powers. The king doesn't have any powers. It's kind of like chess where the king is a pretty unremarkable piece, but it's also the most important piece as you win once it gets to the center. The blocker is a much more defensive piece because it has two properties. The first is that if your blocker is in a ring, the opponent cannot rotate that ring. So in this case here, red is not able to rotate the outermost ring because green has a blocker in it. And if both players' blockers are in a ring, neither player is able to rotate the ring. The ring is just completely locked. The next piece here is the pusher. The pusher is able to, as the name implies, push pieces around. So in this case, this pusher can actually push the other pusher one space forward, as such. It can only push them one space at a time, and if a piece is on the edge of the board, the pusher can push them off the edge as such, and they'll be sent back to the starting area here, and they can just be placed again on the next turn if the opponent wants. The pusher also has the ability to push your opponent's pieces upon entry, meaning if your opponent decides to be cheeky and place one of their own pieces on your entry tile, you wouldn't be able to place any other piece there, but you can use the pusher to push it out of the way. The pusher cannot push your own pieces, and it's also not able to push the blockers, meaning that this blocker is completely safe from the pusher. Another thing is that if two pieces are in a row, like such, the pusher is not able to push either one of them. It can only push one piece at a time. And then the last piece is the destroyer, which is a completely offensive piece, unlike the blocker, which is a completely defensive piece. So whenever two destroyers are lined up in the same row, like so, then every single piece in this row here gets destroyed, including the destroyers themselves. So this is basically like a very powerful bomb that you want to use wisely because it can eliminate your own pieces. And yeah, so if the destroyers got lined up like this, it would eliminate the red blocker, both the green destroyers, and both colors pushers. Destroyers are the only way to get rid of an opponent's blockers, meaning that if green puts a blocker here, the pusher can't move it out of the way, but if red is able to line up two destroyers in the same row, it will be able to destroy the blocker like that. So that about sums up the rules for each piece. Some additional rules are if a piece has just been placed, you can't move it within the same turn. If a piece can only be moved once in a turn, so you can't, for example, have all three of your actions just be to move the king 3 spaces. You can only move the king one time, and then he can't be moved anymore. The exception is rotating rings. You can, say, move the king and then rotate the ring he's on. That's fine. Rotating a ring doesn't actually count as moving a piece, even though the piece's positions are changing. As for rotating rings, you can't rotate it 360 degrees because that's the same thing as doing nothing at all. You can't rotate the same ring twice in a turn unless something has caused the configuration of pieces on that ring to change from your first action to your second or third. So for example, maybe this king here is about to win, so I could, if I wanted to, rotate this ring as the first action, move the pusher to push this king away as the second action, and now because the pusher is in a different spot, the configuration in this ring has changed, so I can then rotate this ring a third time. This would also apply if, say, rotating the ring caused two destroyers to activate. So I could rotate it like this, cause everyone to get destroyed except for this king, and then rotate it again if I wanted to. So yeah, that about sums up the rules for this game. It is a bit problematic in some senses. For example, if I decide to do this as my first turn, there's not a whole lot that red can do. The only move that red can make is to put a pusher here, and then they can't rotate this outer ring, and they can't move the pusher again because they just placed it, which means that green has a pretty overwhelming advantage already, and it's only the first turn. Another issue is that if you have two attackers on the board, you can, as long as you have the ability to rotate both of them, you can line them up literally wherever you want, which makes them very, very powerful. And even if, say, I had a blocker in this row, I can just move the attacker out and then rotate them however I want. So that could potentially cause problems, making the attackers far too powerful. Hopefully I will be able to find some ways to weaken the attackers as well as strengthen the blockers, because it turns out that you can usually just go around the blockers most of the times, meaning that the only thing the blockers are actually useful for is preventing your opponent from entering the ring, and that's just very frustrating for whoever happens to be going second. But yeah, that about sums up the game. I hope that you at least found this interesting, and hopefully I'll complete development of this board game and eventually have a physical board that can be played on.